Welcome to the Conshy Coaching Podcast, where we take the concepts of mindset and energy leadership coaching and make them real so that you can get out of your own way, beat the burnout, and create a life and career that you love. I'm your host, Jenn Masse. Hello, and welcome to the 8th episode of the Conshy Coaching Podcast. Today, I have Wahiba Senan joining me. Sarah is a certified energy leadership coach who is passionate about supporting women who realize they followed the rules life gave them, but wake up one day and realize that they aren't satisfied with the life they're in. Through her coaching practice, Sarah focuses on breaking the big changes people can change into small, sustainable chunks so that they can live a life that fulfills them. I'm personally very excited about today's episode because Sarah and I will be talking about cultivating resilience, which, in light of what's happening in the world right now with the coronavirus pandemic, it's an incredibly important topic. As a quick note, Sarah and I are recording this during the mandatory social distancing period, so I apologize in advance if you hear either of our dogs bark or any other background noises. Sarah, thank you so much for being on today's show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this topic given the times that we're in.
So before we dive in, I would love for you to just introduce yourself a little bit further and tell us what you're working on now.
Yeah, so I'm a life coach and I've been doing this for about 4 years and I got certified in 2016. Before that, I spent a ton of time in retail management and I combine a lot of my experience there with leadership with my life coaching. And right now I've been focusing solely on women and just helping them to tap out of the autopilot in their life, whether that be one-on-one coaching or in-person workshops. And obviously, given light of the times, it's going to be shifting into a more virtual experience as well. And just really helping people to kind of break down the bigger pieces into smaller chunks so it feels more manageable and they can go after the change that they want.
That's awesome. And I also focus on coaching women. So I think that having you on the show, especially right now, is so important because I'm sure you've seen it in your client base as well. But women are really bearing the burden of the shelter in place and quarantine that we're all experiencing because statistics show that women tend to take more of the responsibility with childcare and keeping the house clean, all while maintaining a job outside of work. And even with men doing more and more to help support, that role of playing teacher is now one more thing that's being added to their plate.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one thing that's on your website that I love and that we've already introduced is that you're all about making small choices that can lead to extraordinary changes. And when I think about cultivating resilience and really helping women and the few men listeners that I have listened to this podcast as well, but when I think about helping people cultivate resilience, it really comes down to what small choices can you make right now to help you feel your emotions and really prevent you from crumbling under the weight of the world and rather seizing the opportunity to come out stronger and more resilient than ever before. And when you and I chatted about this topic earlier, you brought up a really good point. Everybody is processing the coronavirus and the shutdown and all the stresses that come with it. Everyone's processing it at a different speed.
Yeah, and it's interesting because this isn't really something that we could have prepared for. It's just like, here it is, it happened. And everybody's processing. What I'm seeing in the collective is everyone's processing the same thing, how their life is impacted and changed because of the coronavirus, but it's showing up so differently. And that idea just kept really like resonating with me. And I kept like really analyzing what I was seeing in my own close personal circle and then what I was seeing on social media and then even my own journey where I've kind of gone up and down or back and forth with, I'm in a good place and now I'm backwards. And really what I've come to kind of just accept is this is a process and there are different stages and there is an element of grief involved because we're losing the life that we were in before and there wasn't a ton of time to prepare to say, okay, here you are, you're going to be in your house and here's how your job is going to change. And everyone's feeling the shift in a different way. And it's been really, really interesting to watch how it's really important to break it down. And it's not about, okay, let's just be resilient and like pick yourself back up, because like I said, there is so much grieving involved, you know? So it's like, how do we stop and feel? And for me personally, that was really hard, to just stop and sit in the emotions of what was coming up, and to say, okay, this is the right thing for me to do right now, because the autopilot of before was easy button your way out of it and then keep moving, right? So now it's like, okay, it's not about the easy button, it's about the actual effective button to get through to the other side. And that's been my biggest takeaway so far. And I'm sure I'll have several more as we go through this process. It's just really like giving the space, because if we go like the old school style of resilience, which is just pick yourself up and keep moving, I fear there's a lot of bypassing in that. And resilience is not bypassing and actually sitting in what is coming up.
And you know what's so interesting? When you were saying grieving what we once knew and trying to step into what this new thing is without having time to prepare, I actually just got off a client call and we were talking about the rules that we all create for ourselves to help us navigate life.
Mm-hmm.
And every single rule, every single human has had that harsh reality that whatever rules they were living by that were keeping them safe and keeping them going since, I guess, January when this hit in China and March when this really started to show up in the United States, those rules are no longer serving us. And those rules are no longer protecting us. And having that reality check of like, holy crap. And to your point, rather than just putting on a tough face and saying, all right, well, let's just keep bulldozing, it's taking time to understand, well, what were those rules that I was living by? And how do I have to change them so I can successfully navigate this situation right now?
Yeah, I think, and it's creating a really interesting dynamic in people's lives because the rules are not the same, and we are hardwired for routine and certainty. And right now, there's not a ton of routine and certainty. And it was a 180 shift, right? All of a sudden, we were like, okay, hopefully this is going to get better. And then, okay, quarantine, you know, and here we are in our homes. And that's changing a lot. And I even made the comment to my own coach earlier this week how I felt like so many things that I had thought I had processed through are triggered right now. And they're very up for me because the rule book I had, I can't lean on. And now, you know, there's such a change and there's all this stuff that's coming up. And it's just, it does bring up a lot, and it can be very jarring. And I think that goes back to the point that I made earlier. It's important, as uncomfortable as it may be, to actually sit in the emotions. And I know that might be like a kind of heady term, like just sit in the emotions. But if we don't feel it, it's going to come back up. My own personal experience where I feel like all these like issues that I thought I had settled are back up. I thought I handled them and I may have bypassed them in the past. And now here we are in this crazy time and they are back up. So it's important to really process through instead of plow through. And I think that is like a big distinction that is important to note when it comes to resilience, that it's not about just getting through to the other side. It's about taking the steps to get through to the other side. It might look different or it might look the same on the outside looking in, but it's actually a very different process.
And you know what's so interesting about what you were just saying about giving yourself the time to feel those emotions and following the steps to cultivate the resilience. And I've been attending a series on cultivating resilience led by Sandro Formica, who's a PhD who has studied happiness and resilience for over a decade. And he actually has an 8-step process to help people cultivate that resilience so that they can walk out the other side of this stronger. And before you even get to the emotions, it's assessing and understanding your needs, understanding what your core values are, rediscovering and celebrating your talents, and understanding how those talents can be shared to help the world.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not until you get to the 5th step that you really start to connect to those deeper emotions, because it's understanding, why are these emotions coming up for me? What need or value isn't being met
Mm-hmm.
that's triggering this emotion? And not being met would really trigger an emotion of sadness or grief or happiness if your need and value is being fulfilled.
Right.
After that, it then goes into, how can I use all of this to create a life plan that allows you to stand in your power and know that you're strong enough to bounce back from whatever the world throws at you? And that's resilience.
Yeah. And I think being in the coaching world and, having exposure to iPEC where we both went through to get our certification, it's like very commonplace for us to know what our values and our needs are, right? Like, so that's one of the steps that was in there. And like, sometimes I feel like I might even take it for granted. I don't know if you feel the same way where it's like, yes, I know what my values and my needs are because we've done so many processes and then we're helping our own clients to figure out their own values and needs. But I wonder, and I'm curious about the collective, like how many people actually do pause and say, okay, what are their values and what are their needs? And right now that might be creating such a disconnect for people because who's taken the time to pause and actually think about some of those things? So I do think that pause piece is really, really important, and not judging what is coming up in order to go through those steps that you just described, because there's a lot and it feels so heavy and so saturated. And, it's just kind of a tangent for me. I am very connected to what my values and my needs are. And I can usually self coach myself to say, okay, I'm triggered here because a value or need wasn't met. But earlier this week, I was in a place where I was like spiraling. And I realized a value and a need that I have is connection. And I was kind of overlooking it because I took for granted how easy it was for me to have that be met. And I was like, oh my goodness, this need of connection is just, it's not being met the way that it was. And it was really triggering me. When I came to a point of acceptance of, wow, that is one of my values and needs, right? So sometimes they do overlap. It allowed me to say, okay, how can I get that met? And then I was able to go into that cycle that you described. So I think it's an interesting dynamic that we're seeing now with the collective, because there are certain things that people may not even be aware of, and it's being triggered on such a deep level right now.
What's so interesting about that is I am also very tied into my values thanks to iPEC and taking the values assessment and working with my own coach to make sure that I understand my values and I'm living a life that's in alignment with those values. But I think what's so interesting and something I hadn't thought of until I joined this webinar series on cultivating resilience is the actual need aspect of it. And if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, at the base, you have food, shelter, basic needs. And thankfully, we live in a developed country. So those basic needs are being met.
Mm-hmm.
The next level in his pyramid is safety and security.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, for the majority of people, and I'm going to say probably everybody,
Mm-hmm.
that need of safety and security is at risk right now
Yeah.
because there is this hidden virus
Mm-hmm.
that we don't know really where it is.
Mm-hmm.
It could be on any surface, it could be floating in the air, and that is crossing our need for safety and security.
Yeah, and I even think that basic, that first rung of the pyramid, it's food, water, and shelter. And some people are like, I don't know where money's coming in from next. So even that one's being triggered. But then definitely the safety need, really like that security piece, because like we said earlier, the rules that we followed are no longer in play. It's a different rule book that we haven't had time to even review, and we're living it now. So I think that it's important to note that we are in a time where people are feeling not safe. They're not feeling secure. Some people might not know where their next paycheck is going to come from. And then consequently, how are they going to support themselves? How are they going to support their families? And that creates such a trigger that then it becomes even harder to go into like the next level on the pyramid, which is belonging and love and connection. It can create this very wonky dynamic, especially when you think about people in either friendships or relationships. You might have somebody who feels really good when it comes to, their safety and security. They might not feel like super firm foundation, but they're like, okay, I got this. And they're ready to move on to like that belonging and connection, where somebody else that they're like in a close relationship with might be like, I don't know where money's coming in and I have to pay these bills and what's going to happen to me in 3 months. Right. So that's going to create another dynamic that's going to create a need for resiliency just in relationships, because we do know connection is so important to humans. So there's so many layers to what's happening right now and so many ways to kind of look at it. And that's why I do love this pyramid, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because it gives a framework. And I think frameworks are so important at times like this for people to be able to look at, because it allows a way to understand something that feels so difficult to really digest and take in.
And I think what's so important, and you hit on this, but every need is fulfilled by either the feeling of being approved of or a feeling of being in control. So if you feel like your needs are being met because you're approved of, or you feel like at least you're in control of the situation, your need will be fulfilled, which will allow you to be resilient and move forward because you know that you'll be safe and secure and you know that you have things taken care of.
Mhm.
And because those basic needs of, the grocery store being empty or the paycheck,
Mhm.
we feel out of control,
Mhm.
which means that we don't feel like we can move into those feelings of connection and love because at the bare minimum, we're like, how am I going to feed my family?
Mhm.
Or I'm going to go into the grocery store and I can't even make a list because I don't know if they're going to have blueberries or blackberries, or maybe they won't have any fruit. And then what am I going to have on top of my oatmeal?
Mhm.
So I think that's something really important that you just hit on there. And something that I actually just posted it to my blog, but there's 3 questions that people can ask themselves when it comes to need fulfillment and assessing what their needs are.
Mhm.
And the 3 questions are, do you know what needs you have? So, whether it be at home, with your family, at work, with your finances, with your friends, do you know what those needs are?
Mhm.
Once you know what your needs are, do you know who you rely on to fulfill those needs?
Mhm.
So, personally, when I think about my relationship, like intimate relationships, one of my needs is to feel supported.
Mhm.
I rely on my husband for that.
Mhm.
So then the next step is on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being not supported at all and 10 being very supported, how much do I actually feel like he is supporting me and how satisfied am I with his support?
Mhm.
And if the number isn't 10, then you have to take that step back and say, okay, well, can I have a conversation to change that? Or do I need to look somewhere else?
Mhm.
And I think that's so important, especially right now as we are being forced to evaluate what our needs and values are, is taking time to understand not just what they are, but what's in our power and our control to get those protected and to start aligning with them.
Right. And I think, there's a lot of stuff to just explore just with those few questions, because do we know what our needs are? And I think, like I said earlier, so many people haven't really taken the time to know what their needs are, and all of a sudden their needs aren't getting met, and it's like, oh my God, what do I do? There's a void or there's this gap, but what do I do? So they can't even identify it. And then even further, when you can identify it, have people taken that inventory to say, like, do I know who I rely on to meet these needs? And then further, right now, given the times that we're in, it can feel so difficult to have those conversations to say, hey, wait, my needs aren't getting met, because everybody's rule book has been changed. Everybody, so the example you use with your husband's rule book has changed, your rule book has changed. And now how do you collectively kind of come together in order to say, okay, like, how are we going to readjust the new rule book? Right. And that could be a difficult conversation for people to have, no matter how long they've been in the relationship, whether it's friendship, spouse, it can be very, very difficult, because all of a sudden you're sitting and you're in the triggers. And just personally, I know on Tuesday, and again, I know connection is a big value and need for me. But by the end of the day, I was like, wow, like, I'm feeling this void. And I realized I was feeling this void because the only in-person conversations that I had were at social distance, 6 feet apart. And it was with the cashier at the pet store because I had to get something for my dog so she could take her medicine. And then a neighbor, I don't even know her name, and we were 8 feet apart from each other. And here I was, of course, feeling this void because I'm like, oh my goodness. And like, it was hard for me to put that in play. And then I realized, wow, in person connection is really important. It's not just connection. And that's really difficult to meet. And who can I get that met from? So those questions are really good. They're amazing, but there's such a deep level to them. And that could even feel overwhelming for some folks just to kind of sit and process through that.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, frameworks are so important, and I think that's where really understanding the energy leadership model that you and I have both been trained in is so important because it helps people start to understand, are they approaching something with that catabolic energy that's really draining them?
Mhm.
So approaching this being like, "Whew, this is a really heavy exercise. I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if I have the space for it."
Mhm.
Or approaching it with anabolic energy, which is more like, ooh, this is a great opportunity to actually press pause and take the time to evaluate what's really important to me. Because I think a lot of people are starting to realize that things that they thought were important in the normal hustle and bustle in life are really not that important.
Mhm.
And I think this is forcing that reality upon them, whether it's a corporation that's like, "Oh, you must be in the office to work and there's no other way around it." And all of a sudden like, "Hey, you can work from home."
Right.
Because they don't have an option. Or people with families with kids that are very much like, "I need to be doing this, and they need to be having play dates, and I need to make sure that they're being fed this and not being on the screen too often."
Mhm.
It's reassessing that, being like, "You know what? As long as we're together as a family, it really doesn't matter what they're doing,
Right.
as long as we're together as a family." They don't have to be playing with friends down the street. They can keep themselves occupied, or I can step in and we can do a puzzle together.
Right.
But I just think that that framework of even at the base level of catabolic and anabolic energy is so important for people trying to understand what is happening inside them.
Yeah, and I think I know you talked about this in a previous episode of yours, the whole anabolic and catabolic energy and the levels of energy. But that's another thing that I've really been thinking about too, because there's these 7 levels of energy, and everyone's always like, okay, the higher the better, right? That's the old rule book that society gave us, the higher the better, without even understanding what the 7 levels are, right? And I know when I first went to iPEC, it's like, all right, how can I get straight to level 7? And then realizing I don't know that I want to live at level 7. So for anybody that's not like fully aware of it, there's these 7 levels of energy, and we're tapping into them all the time. And what I'm finding is right now, there are a lot of people who are in those catabolic energy places. Level 1 being, I don't have a choice and I'm really afraid. And right now, that's really coming up big for people. And level 2 is, I'm really angry and I need to make sure I get mine. And if that means you don't get yours, fine. Like, I need to get mine. And that might be toilet paper, food, whatever the case may be. And that's like, we're seeing that, like literally walking in the grocery store, we're seeing the panic on people's face and we're seeing the empty shelves, and we're going online. Like, I need laundry detergent and I won't get it until April 10th because people are buying this stuff so much. And that's that catabolic energy. But also, it's not good or bad. And that took me a really long time. Like, just like yesterday, I kind of came to that realization where I was this week in this very, very spiraling place of, I'm really afraid. I feel like I have no choices. And I'm really mad that we're in this situation and it wasn't stopped. And I have no control. So, like, you can hear just in what I described, and that was like real talk of what I was experiencing and still am to some extent. It's that level 1 and 2, like bouncing back and forth. And yesterday I had this realization of, what if I didn't judge that anymore? And it's just, that is what I'm feeling. And I continue to process through that. And how much stronger will I be when I get to the other side of this? Because as much as it feels like, wait, getting to the other side of this, what does that even look like? I do have this deep knowing that I will, and we all will. It's just going to be at different rates. But for me personally, I really do think that sitting in that and really not judging it and allowing myself to process it all, no matter how uncomfortable it is allowing me to continue to process so that I'm not carrying stuff and there's not a wound or a trigger 3 years later in another situation that may feel similar, and it'll allow me to kind of process through that.
Yeah, and I think what you just hit on that is so important is the fact that the only time that is right now is the present.
Mm-hmm.
So, being able to realize that you're angry because this wasn't stopped.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that happened in the past and that's out of your control. So, the realization you had is, I will get through this and I don't know what the future is going to look like, but I know that I'll get there. So, what can I just pause on and control in this moment? And that's processing my emotions and making small choices every day to help me realize that I can have good moments and that there can be good that comes out of this if I let there be good that comes out of it. But I have to let it happen.
Right. And in a time when we don't feel like control, it almost feels counterintuitive to be like, well, I can control that. I'm going to sit in these crazy, wonky, uncomfortable, triggering feelings, but we can control that. And that does allow us to be in the present to release that attachment to the past. Like, I know for me, my birthday was last weekend and all the plans got changed. And I had so many different things that I was so excited about, both personally, aside from my birthday, and professionally for March. And my mind keeps going to, that was all taken from me. But the more that I just sit in the feelings, I can control, okay, just sit and release. And really back to that concept of grief. Like, grieve that those plans didn't happen and mourn the loss of them so that I can move forward. Because if I'm just like, okay, let's just pick up and go and let me move forward, that is going to create further issues down the line. Like, there's that need for, I keep seeing the concept of grief, but there's also, like, I think it's very closely connected to release.
Mm.
Release what could have been and what didn't happen so that we can create the next thing that we're going to create as we continue to move forward, and as the collective moves forward, and we create these new rule books that we're going to be living by.
Yeah, and you know what's tied to that concept and something that's helped me personally release is looking back on things that I'm grateful for that have prepared me for this moment.
Mm-hmm.
So I am incredibly grateful that I do have an online model for my coaching business because at least that part was figured out.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it sent me scrambling because all of my speaking engagements were canceled and I mainly network in person, but at least I had this one piece figured out where, okay, I already coach people through video. I'm good.
Mm-hmm.
But then I was even talking to my neighbors, and a couple months ago, they were really struggling because they had to let their nanny go, and they've still been struggling and feeling poorly about that decision. And they've been struggling with coronavirus and worried because they have 1-year-old girls and they don't want the girls to get sick, rightfully so. And I just had that moment of pause where I was like, your old nanny was an Uber driver.
Mm-hmm.
And how grateful are you that you made that decision then? Because your new nanny, you know where she lives and you know that she goes home, and other than going to the grocery store and spending time with her immediate family, you know that she's protected.
Mm-hmm.
Where your old nanny would have been still Uber driving as much as possible to try to make that money.
Right.
And how grateful are you that you're no longer put in the position where you'd have to be like, hey, I don't want you near my children because I don't know if you have the virus because of whatever passenger you picked up.
Right. Yeah. And I think there's two concepts at play there. There's the element of like there is a purpose to everything. And, your neighbors, like there was a purpose in releasing that nanny back then. And now here they are. And like there is a little bit more peace of mind as much as that was a struggle. But for some people, it might be really difficult to find the purpose in some stuff right now. So it's like, how do you lean into that? And that brings me to the second point you brought up is gratitude. So yes, they're grateful. And again, it might be really hard to find ways to be grateful for what's going on right now. Like I know if somebody came to me just this past Wednesday and was like, Sarah, what can you find that you're grateful for in this situation? I would have been like, are you crazy? There's nothing. And I'm all about gratitude. Gratitude was one of the cornerstones of when I really changed my life and went through my own like kind of awakening. And like I say, 2015 was the year that I woke up, and gratitude was one of the tools that carried me through because it really allowed me to like sit in the appreciation of what was happening. And, I've kind of realized that doesn't need to go away, even if it feels hard. And sometimes it's just being grateful that, especially right now, that you can FaceTime with somebody, or grateful that, yesterday you got out of bed at 11 and this morning you got out of bed at 8, and that feels like progress, or like grateful for those little things, because that will allow you to be able to pull yourself out, even if it's for a brief moment, and not be in the judgment of what's going on, but more the appreciation. And it releases that expectation, especially as we continue. And I keep going back to this, but I think it was such a good framework. The rule book is different, so we're going into these expectations, but when Tony Robbins says this, when you trade expectation for appreciation, your whole life changes. So it's like, what little moment can you be appreciative for? I'm appreciative that I only woke up 3 times in the middle of the night last night instead of 4, because it's been 4 this whole week. And I really am really appreciative of that. I'm so grateful. And I'm sitting in the appreciation of that, and when I woke up today, I didn't feel the tightness in my chest that I felt the day before as deeply. It's still there, but it's not as much. And I think it's just when we look for things to be grateful for, it's not saying just slap like a smiley face over it and keep it moving, like good vibes only, because that is bypassing, but really saying there's progress, because it's small little things that are going to allow us to snowball to get through this, because it's not going to be this like, okay, hit the button, here we are, we're out. It's a process. And I think gratitude really is something that can really help to shift that experience that we're all feeling, wherever everybody is in their own journey. And it can be done in such a simple way.
Yeah, and I think there's so much to that, especially those times where you might not be able to find it in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay because you're allowed to sit and grieve and be in that funk.
Mm-hmm.
But you at least need to be able to be willing to look
Mm-hmm.
and realize that, you know what, I'm going to honor my funk,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm not going to live in my funk.
Yes.
And maybe before I go to bed, I'm going to try to write down a couple things that I'm grateful for, because you really shouldn't go to bed worried. There's this whole scientific background to the damage it does to your subconscious to go to bed worried. But by doing something as simple as practicing gratitude and reminding yourself that I'm enough and I will survive this, whatever this may look like,
Mhm.
is enough to train your subconscious to help build that resilience to step out of it.
So much is coming up for me as you're sharing that. It's like the honor the funk and living in the funk. Like, I think that even it can look and feel the same sometimes, but like honoring that funk can allow that release. We're living in it. There's no way we're going to release it because, like, imagine if it's a basket or a big box that you're in, right? Or a big box that's there and that's full of the funk. If you're honoring it, you're on the outside looking in and you're still experiencing whatever funk is in that box. But if you're living in it, you're actually in that big box. There's no way you can release that box and start to break it down and get rid of it. You're still going to experience the funk, but it's choosing that distinction of what that looks like. And then even the gratitude, there was, and I can't remember who it was, but it was a mommy blogger years ago, and she was talking about how she started to really incorporate gratitude in her life. And she made it a point to like write down something and the notes on her phone of what she's grateful for every single day. And she made a commitment she was going to do it. And she was experiencing a medical situation. She had such a hard time thinking what she was grateful for that one day. And then she realized, you know what? As sick as she felt that day, she was grateful that when she laid down on her couch, that her blanket felt really warm around her. And I remember that, and I bring it up because that is something small that we can still find those little moments to appreciate, like in the days that might feel really long. And it's like, what day is it? What time is it? What's the construct of time, right? Like that's all flipped upside down. But we can find like those little moments. Like right now, I'm really grateful that I'm able to have this conversation with you and be able to talk about it, because as much as I believe that this will help the listeners, it's also helping me right now. And I'm grateful that my coffee, like I had the perfect cream to coffee ratio this morning and it tasted amazing. And those are things that we can be grateful for, but sometimes our mind leaps to, I want to be grateful for that highlight reel. And right now there's no highlight reel. So it really is the little moments.
Mm-hmm.
And I do believe that at the end of this, that's going to be a part of the new rule book, is appreciating the little things, because the big things really might not have mattered as much as we gave it credit for.
I think that's so spot on. And I think it's, it really is the little things. And then also appreciating the value that we have to give to the world. And everybody has it. Everybody has a purpose for being here. And I think this is giving us that opportunity to really tap into our talents, whatever those talents may be, to help our community and help ourselves and help those around us
Mm-hmm.
get through this. And one example of this I absolutely love is I saw the other day that one of my really good friends is a photographer, and most photographers are really struggling right now because you have to be close to your clients.
Mm-hmm.
And she actually got the idea from a couple up in Massachusetts, but she's adopting it here in Conshohocken, and it's called the Front Steps Project. And she was walking around town with her Zoom lens and taking family portraits of people sitting on their front steps.
Mm-hmm.
Some are formal family photos, some are them being really goofy, but she's doing this not to make a profit, but to raise money for an organization helping those struggling with the coronavirus and COVID-19. And I just think that there's so much beauty in that, where with photography, it's memories, it's joy, it's all of this, but she's using her skill
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and able to do it that safe distance from the curb with a zoom lens and bring joy not only to the families, but she's helping the broader community in the process. And I just think there's so much beauty to taking that time to think, what is my talent
Yes.
and how can I use that to help the greater good?
Yes, yes. And I got goosebumps as you were sharing that. But I do think sometimes it feels so foggy right now, but everybody does have a talent. And I'm seeing this especially in people that are self-employed, right? Like right now, being self-employed feels a little bit different. And again, those rule books have changed, so it's like, how do people shift their models? And I know some of my friends and people that I know, they're like, okay, how do I shift my model? But there are those gifts. When we kind of peel back the layers of, okay, all the noise that's going on, like, what are the gifts that you bring to the table? What are the things that you're really good at? Where have you gotten feedback? And how can you find a way to cut back on the noise that's sometimes coming from ourselves and say, there's a reason you have these gifts and there's a reason you have this nudge to bring this forward. And what if your biggest critic was just yourself? How can you bring that forward? And how might that impact people as they're continuing to make sense of their own lives? Because people do have gifts, and before. It was, okay, make sure it's perfect before we put it out there. And I don't know that we have time for perfection right now, but further, I don't think we ever had a need for it. My greatest wish is that people can push that perfectionism to the side and just say, here I am, here's my talent, here it is, I have it to offer. And whatever the cost might be, whatever the donation might be, whatever that is, that will make a difference, because that in itself will inspire somebody else. And then it'll inspire somebody else. And that is how we can still stay connected as we're moving through this like crazy crisis that our whole world is in.
I mean, you hit on it right there, is that there's no reason to apologize for what your talent is, whatever your talent may be. So if your talent is being the optimist and inspiring people and always looking on the sunny side of life,
Mm-hmm.
don't apologize for it. That is giving people so much light. And even though some people might not be ready to hear it, when they are ready to hear it, they'll look to you
Mm-hmm.
to share that light.
Right.
And if your talent is being the realist, that's okay too, because people do need the realistic facts shared right now.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And there's gold no matter what side of the coin that you're on. So don't ever apologize for who you are and the light that you bring to the world. And don't be afraid to show it.
Right. And I think we're seeing that where some people may be afraid. And I know for me personally, it's like, okay, how do I bring my skill sets to the table differently? Because yes, I am set up online, but a big portion in my strategy was set up to be more in person. The online piece was just to support it. So for me, it's like, okay, how do I show up online? And that's like, I'm way out of my comfort zone. But when I actually sit in what I have to offer and actually think, okay, what if I took the perfectionist lens off and just said, okay, here's what I have to offer. How can I then bring what I have to bring to the table, bring that forth? And it just releases, again, that term of release, it releases that feeling of constriction and that feeling of, oh, it has to be a certain way. Because again, the rule book is different. So why in this new time should I or anybody follow the old rule book? Because it's not relevant anymore. And that can feel jarring, but there's also a piece of it. And this is a very new insight for me. Like, this is happening in the last 5 minutes, real time. But there's a lot of freedom in that.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much freedom in just saying, okay, here's what I can bring to the table, and I'll figure it out as I go.
Yeah. And that freedom and that here's what I can do and that release, that's anabolic energy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the energy that gives us the freedom of choice and the ability to see opportunity in everything.
Yes. Yes.
So I'm sure we could go on and on about this. It's a really deep topic, but I did just look at the time and we are coming up at the end. So before we wrap it up, what is one piece of advice that you have for anyone that wants to make the small choice to start cultivating resilience and finding strength from the current situation?
Yeah, I think it's let yourself feel the feelings. And if you can find a way to identify it, great. But if you're feeling not great, right, or not the way you want to feel, let yourself sit with that and find the people that you can maybe bounce things off of, and talk through what is coming up, because there is a way to get some connection right now, and it might not be the way that it was, but also we can combine that connection piece along with sitting in it, because sitting in those uncomfortable feelings alone is not fun, right? That's not somebody's like, oh, I want to do this today. But finding ways to make the uncomfortable feel a little bit more manageable. I don't even want to say make the uncomfortable more comfortable, just make it feel more manageable. But first and foremost, like, how can you find ways to let yourself feel safe when you're sitting in the uncomfortable and the discomfort that's coming up right now? I think that is one of my biggest lessons over these last few weeks, and just sitting in it. And sometimes that's the best that you can do, and that's going to get you to exactly where you want to be, as counterintuitive as that seems and feels.
I couldn't agree more with that, which is just sitting and feeling. And everybody's outside of their comfort zone right now. So I think you nailed it, which is how can we just make this feel manageable?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And allowing us to just sit and manage the uncomfortable feelings and take the opportunity to learn from it.
Yes.
So that once this all goes away and we step into whatever the new normal may look like,
Mm-hmm.
we have the ability to then be comfortable with the uncomfortable because we know that we've been there before. So that is all the time that we have for today. Sarah, thank you so much for joining me on the Conshy Coaching Podcast. It has been a really dynamic conversation. I have got a lot out of it and had a few of my own wake-up calls as we were chatting. So thank you so much. And you're welcome back anytime you'd like to be on the show.
Yes, I'd love to be back on the show, and thank you for this, because this 40 minutes has allowed me to process things that I was like, when am I going to ever be able to process some of this stuff? So I feel like I made a couple of small steps myself from this conversation. So thank you.
I'm glad I could help. That was episode 8 of the Conshy Coaching Podcast. If you'd like to connect with Sarah Wahiba Senan, I've included her website and contact information in the episode notes. If you would like to learn more about cultivating resilience and to download workbooks to support your journey to self-discovery, please check out my blog at conshycoaching.com/blog. As always, if you'd like to learn more about mindset and energy leadership coaching, please subscribe to my channel and join my weekly email list so that you never miss an episode or a blog post. Thanks for listening and have a wonderful day.